Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining in. My name is Shruti Sundaresan, and on behalf of the Foundation for Advancing Science and Technology of FAST India, I welcome you all to our World Environment Day celebrations. Um, First of all, a very, very happy World Environment Day to everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Today, we are going to be hosting a very interesting speaker for a talk on efficient solid waste management. I'm very, very excited to welcome Brian McCarthy, who's going to be our esteemed speaker this evening. Brian is an integrated waste management specialist with extensive international experience in assessing, enhancing, and operating waste and resources management systems, strategies, policies, technologies, infrastructure, and training. He is a UK chartered waste manager holding an MSc in Environmental Management and Policy from the International Institute for Industrial Environment Economics at Lund University, Sweden. He has a deep understanding of waste and environmental policy, complemented by experiences gained as a field practitioner in municipal waste system designs, commissioning, and operation in over 25 countries. A core competence of Brian is working with local counterparts to develop their waste management solutions and systems appropriate to their specific local conditions. Currently, Brian is a team leader on the GIZ Finance Cities Combating Plastic, entering the marine environment, which is the CCP-ME project, assisting Kochi, Kanpur, Port Blair, and their respective states. It's an absolute pleasure to host you for this session, Brian. Thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of this session. Brian is going to be speaking to us about efficient solid waste management in India, and this is something that we're very, very excited to hear more about. So without any further ado, Brian, over to you.
Thanks, Shruti. Very nice to be here. I have just come back from 4 weeks in India, and I live in Hungary, so I am back in Hungary, but I had a quick stop off at Lund University, where I did my master's some 20 years ago. And during that visit, we were commenting that how much the world has changed in that 20 years, but then again, how little it has changed. We're still facing many of the same challenges that we were discussing 20 years ago, and we haven't really moved forward as a global community to combating these waste management challenges. So a very topical subject today, improving the efficiency of solid waste management. We often talk about circular economies these days, and we are still trying to move away from that open disposal sites and the marine pollution, that, which is the project I'm working on in the 3 cities that you discussed. So I thought I would just discuss the topic being solid waste management and improving its efficiency. I thought I would just quickly show you some practical experience or illustrations of what I experienced during my last 4 weeks in India, to illustrate where those efficiency, the lack of efficiency is occurring. So here is a common community bin. So when we discuss waste management, like I said, we're moving towards this circular economy, which is for organics, taking our food from the field through us, taking the residual and the other fecal matter, etc., back into circulation, back into compost, anaerobic digestion, whether in the form of soil amendment through compost or energy through anaerobic digestion and the gas to then return into the economy, and then returning that digestate or compost to the field to then grow the food again. And recyclables going through the product manufacturing and coming back into the production, and then allowing that to come back into consumption and return. So those are the circular economy butterfly that we call. One side it's the wet organics, the other side it's the dry recyclables. Now, the first step in achieving that is being able to capture those resources and capture them as organics and as recyclables. And that's one of the main challenges that we face in improving the efficiency. There is a technology for almost everything in waste management. There's a technology to separate the waste if we need it. There's a technology, the anaerobic digestion, the composting. There's a technology, a very high-end technology for composting and anaerobic digestion, whether that's in-vessel forced aeration composting or just household composting in our own composting bins at a very low tech. Equally so with recycling of plastics. So, but it's whether that technology is applicable, affordable, and available to the communities that we are dealing with. Now, one of the India has a great initiatives. The Clean India mission has been running for many years now. We're now into SBM 2.0. We have the solid waste management rules, which have recently been updated. We've got the plastic waste management rules, which have recently been updated also. We have extended producer responsibility, well established for waste electrical and electronic equipment and coming in for other plastics. And then we also have single-use plastic bans in many states, which are banning the use of plastic bags, straws, plastic cutlery and consumables, and so removing them from the waste stream. But how do we deal with the residual waste, and how do we meet those guidelines? Many of those guidelines are developed at the national level, and India, as I very much realized when I was traveling from Delhi to Kochi to Trivandrum to Kanpur to Lucknow to Port Blair and back to Delhi, is a very large country, equal to almost the size of Europe. And in Europe, we have the European regulations, and then each country is free to implement those regulations in national law in a flexible manner, as long as they meet to the end objective of those regulations. In India, the plastic waste management rules, the solid waste management rules, the SBM 2.0 rules, they are quite prescriptive, and that is quite a challenge for a lot of the states, a lot of the ULBs, a lot of the cities, and a lot of the other stakeholders involved in waste management to try and implement and, more importantly, enforce those rules. A lot of these rules aren't implementable because of the local conditions, or they're not being enforced because either there is no institution available, or the institutions at the local level don't have the resources to enforce, or some other issues, including corruption, which is a big issue that has to be spoken of openly if we're going to get over it. And those are causing some of those issues. Now, here in this video I'm about to show, this is a community bin, which is very common. There is a wheelie bin there, which is a common 1,100 litre bin. But as our project is looking at combating plastics going into the marine environment, we'll see how does that pollution plastics get into the marine environment. So just play this.
Community bins really aren't contained, and it's sitting right next to one of these channels I was talking about. So this is the drainage channel coming from the town, and all this waste would have been washed down yesterday, but it's been blocked by this wooden chassis. I don't know what it is, but it's been tangled up. But this waste will be scattered. There's a lot of food waste ends up in this. There we go, you can see some there. And the dogs come along and rip through the bags, and then doing so they chuck it over the edge into these streams. Then it goes out into the sea then.
So that's an example of a community bin. Now we see the bin is there. If we go back to the start there, we can see the bin is there, but the waste is scattered around the outside. Now there's many reasons for that. Either the bin is not collected often enough, and so it's full and the waste is scattered around. Maybe children are bringing the waste to this community bin area and they can't physically reach up. They're not tall enough to open it and throw it in, or just laziness or from the producer of the waste just throwing it around the bin, or lack of understanding, lack of education to understand that. But what that does, as I said in the video there, a lot of animals, not just the dogs, but this is in Port Blair, there's a lot of cows that go through the waste, and in doing so, they're throwing it over that little parapet wall into that ditch, and then that ends up going into the marine environment. Now we can see here there's a lot of Coca-Cola cans, there's a lot of PET bottles. In Kanpur, that would never be there in the waste stream at this stage. It would already have been removed. In Port Blair, the market is not established. Just because it's out in the Andaman Islands, it's removed from those markets. It's a lot more expensive to ship those recyclable materials to a market. And that's where I'm saying India is such a vast country and has a lot of differences that one size does not fit all. So we have to adjust the system and intervene in different ways to ensure that we get over that. The other problem we have is that there's, and we'll see that in the next video actually, is that these bins, there is no vehicle available to collect those bins efficiently. So what happens is...
This is what I'm talking about, integration of the service.
But इसका तो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट किसी और एजेंसी को दिया हुआ था ना? हाँ? दिया हुआ है सर, हम लोगों को नाइट ड्यूटी। बट वो करते नहीं है क्या काम अपना? नहीं सर, वो तो हम लोग पता नहीं। अच्छा अच्छा, आप करते।
So they've tipped the bin over there and they're raking it out.
Commercial waste, eh?
This is commercial waste. He's saying the contract has been given, but they don't do their job properly.
Must be strong, eh? Very strong.
So we can see there that the equipment is the collection equipment is not suited to the containment. So even if the waste was put into the 110 litre wheelie bin, that there's no mechanism, there is no, the vehicle that's collecting is not compatible with that container and vice versa, which means that the waste is being manually scraped out. And that's reducing the efficiency of that service. That bin could take in the UK or Hungary here, it would take about 20 seconds to 30, about 20 seconds to wheel that bin to the truck, have the truck tip it into the back, compact it and back again. Here we have a good 10 minutes, maybe even more, being taken to scoop it out, take it over. And there's losses in the waste occurring there as they scatter it around and miss some, and some spill out onto the streets. Now, this isn't to say that this is a bad system, it's just incompatible. So when we're selecting technologies and systems, we need to have compatibility to ensure efficiency. And we'll see that a bit more in the next video. Oh no, we'll go back just to the gullies where the waste is coming from into the marine environment. So here's a typical gully in Port Blair, where the stream is coming down through the community. And we can see during the monsoons, during the rain seasons, polystyrene, light plastics, bottles, shoes are a big one, and textiles is becoming a very big one, is being washed down. And then here we can see the state of the beaches in Port Blair. So we can see the beach there is no longer a beach. It's really is full of plastic. And the pigs are feeding primarily off the organics waste, which is coming down these streams and being thrown in the streams there. Now, this is very typical of, unfortunately, of a Port Blair beach. I think there was only one beach in Port Blair where I went to that was a tourist destination and had been cleaned. Every other, about 6 or 7 other beaches that I visited were completely covered in plastic. Now, this is obviously not just a threat to the environment, but it's a threat to the livelihoods of the people of Port Blair and the Andaman Islands. So we talked to the fisheries department in this bay here, and they were saying that the bay is full of E. coli, and so the fish are contaminated with E. coli. The fish are contaminated with plastics and also pesticides, persistent organic pollutants. They can't sell those fish onto the global market because of the poor quality of the marine environment in that area. So that's crippling the income of these communities. It also is really affecting the tourism. Adnan Islands is a beautiful place, should be primarily focused on tourism, yet all the beaches are covered in waste. And I think maybe I might might have another one to show on that in a bit. But just keeping on transfer stations, here's going to Kanpur, where the Clean Cities program has assisted in providing these small Tata Ace and other similar small collection vehicles which go around the communities to collect waste. But we can see
this is the vehicles lined up to enter this transfer station. So this is the middle of the day. I don't know why they're collecting all this waste at the hottest point of the day.
So there's two issues I'm discussing there. One is, so the small vehicles collecting from the households, great. It's keeping the waste moving. One of the main things in improving the efficiency of waste collection and waste management is continuously keeping the waste moving from household into the collection vehicle, into the transfer vehicle if required, and then to the treatment, the material recovery facility or the composting facility, the mechanical biological treatment, or in the instance of Kanpur, and then with only fine residuals going to landfill. If we let the waste stop and lie on the ground, it's very unlikely to be picked up, or if it is picked up, it's in a time lag. And so those animals that we discussed earlier go through and end up distributing all those plastics and other materials into the marine environment. The other one here is that so here we have a problem with the efficiency of that service. All those vehicles which could otherwise be out, drop off the waste at the transfer point, which transfer stations are designed to be improving efficiency and reducing the cost of service. These 8 or 10 vehicles that we saw then, but on other transfer stations we saw more, are sitting there for up to half an hour waiting to load into these transfer containers, which again is not efficient in its design and service. So we'll see how long this takes. So this is either its second or third unloading of this one vehicle. It has to partially unload 1/3 of the waste, then drop the container back down, then the next load while they upload. So it's just tipped. Part of its load is the last tipping of this vehicle.
So this is the transfer station.
Into this smaller hopper. And then we can say they manually load it into this hopper. And then in a very slow mechanism, it's loading it into this compaction unit, self-contained compaction unit. And we can see that whole process there is 51 seconds alone. So that takes about up to 5 minutes for each vehicle to unload into this small hopper. Partial load, a half or a third of the vehicle's contents is lifted at a time, takes 2 or 3 minutes. And then this container itself, 1/3 of the size and the weight of this container is the mechanism, the compaction mechanism, and the mechanical unit that compacts the waste. And that whole unit is then picked up onto a hook loader and transferred to the mechanical biological treatment facility. Now that 1/3 of the space, 1/3 of the weight is being transferred every time, instead of having a static compactor at this unit and filling that container with waste and increasing the efficiencies more. So this is, I don't want to criticize Kanpur because there's reasons why it's designed this way, it's reasons why it's happened. But in our design, we need to ensure that there's a competent institutions and competent bodies within India to design these DPRs, to design the waste management systems, and also to approve those waste management systems. The ULBs at the moment lack that waste management body within their organization, that professional waste management body. Often it's left to the city engineer, who is an engineer, normally a civil engineer. Now, waste management is a lot about economics. It's a lot about technical design, but technical design from a logistics perspective. So rather than someone having been a civil engineer, someone who has worked for DHL or one of the logistics companies are often better suited to be waste managers than a city engineer, just because they know that the components of a waste management system need to be integrated together. So we often talk about integrated waste management, and that often talks about integration of composting with recycling with other, but really it's the integration of waste generation, waste presentation, the containment, the initial containment, the collection system, the transfer system, the composting. All those links need to be linked together. And if there is contractors involved in any of those service provisions, so in Kanpur, there's a private sector is providing the collection, a different contractor is providing the transfer. And the transfer is paid by ton of material transferred. So they don't have an incentive. There's no performance-based matrices that are incentivizing them to separate the wet waste from the dry waste to ensure the efficiency of that separation and that collection. All they want is the maximum weight into those containers to then shift it to the disposal, rather than working together with the different contractors to improve the separation of those dry recyclables, the wet recyclables, and improve the quality of those to improve the ultimate recovery and minimize disposal. And that's a big problem we see in a lot of areas, is that contract administration. And that's supervision, contract writing. A lot of these contracts, these operators are operating on a one-page contract rather than a seriously bespoke contract to identify their key performance indicators, their benchmark indicators, and ensuring their linkages to the next service provider in the chain, both downstream and upstream. And then the oversight and enforcement of those contracts is also lacking. So that contract administration is something we're working with a lot. Here's another, well, very similar in its delivery, is just unloading manually into a compactor truck and just lack of efficiency. Now it's partly due to the design, it's partly due to finance, but it not necessarily due to finance. There's a lot of vehicles, a lot of equipment, a lot of people involved in the waste management system, and they're all well financed. Sometimes the contractors are not paid on time, and that's another issue that needs to be addressed. And the contracts are often only for 1 year, which doesn't give the contractor enough time to invest in appropriate technology. The payments from the municipalities or the city corporations are often not on time or unreliable. And that's another area that needs to be improved. Contracts need to be longer. The payment needs to be secured through an escrow fund to secure that payment and give the operators the confidence to invest in better equipment. But it's not a lack of money. The money is there. The technology is there. It just needs to be better aligned, better connected to ensure that those investments are made. Another one, so I'll just quickly show. So this is an SLRM, a solid and liquid resource recovery center in Port Blair. So manually recovering the material at the local level, which is operating very well. The local people, the local contractors that have these SLRMs are delivering well, but often they are not connected to the PROs. So EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, has the producers of PET bottles or others like Coca-Cola pay into the system to finance the recovery of, or partly finance the recovery of the materials and enable them to go for recycling. What's happening is that they then provide that, they outsource the responsibility for the collection and the management of the collection of those materials to what's called a producer responsible organization. So maybe Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, some other companies group together and finance another company to administer that recovery of those materials. So those PROs are establishing Recycle in Bangalore, some other big PROs are establishing around the country to partly finance the recovery of these materials. But what we're seeing is that these small scale recoverers and the SWM rules, the SBM 2.0, actively encourage informal actors to continue on the waste recovery sector. But what we're seeing is that they don't know the PROs, and there's a disconnect, and it's that communication of what PROs are, where they can get the finances, not disseminating down to the small scale informal actors. So just linking those recoverers to the market and to the PROs is something that we're also improving, and that should hopefully improve the efficiency of these small scale providers. One of the problems we do face with these small scale SLRMs is that there's they take the waste, they recover it, the valuables, but the non-valuable residual waste, there's no mechanism again for that to be transported to a disposal site, and therefore it gets dumped at the side. And this is a very common situation in small scale recyclers and large scale recyclers as well. The residual waste, non-value, if the market collapses, the waste is just pushed off the side and we see it being scattered around into the environment. That's partly contract management. It's partly just mechanisms to improve that and ensuring that there's these recyclers have clearly defined responsibilities and are accountable for certain aspects, and that comes back to the contract administration. So that's a big thing, both in the ULBs themselves, the state level, the ULBs and the private sector, is we need to, all stakeholders and the whole waste management sector, the roles, the responsibilities and accountability and the mechanisms to hold those who are being assigned accountability to be held to account must be improved. And that's where it's lacking. Once we improve that, the transparency of roles, responsibilities and accountability, we can start to enforce the system and improve efficiencies all around. Now, I don't have too much more time, but here's just an example of an SLRM in Port Blair, just to show another beach. And an example of, so here, the vast majority of the waste that we're seeing actually just over that tire pile is glass. And so we're trying to work with them to identify markets for that glass. So it's being recovered separately, but then just being dumped, being stockpiled and quite haphazardly. So part of the efficiency of the service is connecting the feedstock to the recycle or to the recovery, material recovery facilities.
Plastic.
And we can just see here, here's another example of that plastic coming up to the beach. Part of that is coming from the communities, but some of it is just being washed over from foreign areas. And this is a tourism resort just on the other side of the bay here, from that waste on the beach and from that SLRM, that material recovery facility. So we can see how it's very likely to impact tourism and impact the tourist sector. So one thing we're talking about more, or we're less inclined to talk about the improving the environment, talking to ULBs, you must improve the environment, you must do circular economy, you must do recycling because it's good for the environment. We're talking more now about security and resilience. So food security, energy security, water security, income, revenue, GDP security. So ensuring your security of your primary exports, so fishing, fleets, fishing markets, fishing waters, and your tourism, the beautification of the island through tourism, to take it back to them. So if we talk about the environment, if we talk about sustainability, it's a kind of overspoken about, it doesn't really relate to me. But if we take it back to security of supply, security, energy security, so separate your organics matter to create anaerobic digestion, to ensure that we are not reliant on Russian, Ukrainian oils, gas, and having more self-dependency, that's a big one we're talking about. Material recovery, so plastics for manufacturing, particularly in Kanpur. We're not doing it for so much, of course it is for the environment, but primarily let's be clear that this is going to improve your local economy by returning materials back to the producers that are in your local economy, and then stimulating that market and sustaining that market and not being reliant on foreign markets for those raw resources. So that's something that's we've made a shift from talking about the environment to take it more to the ULB, to the city commissioner. What can this do for you? And this is going to secure your energy, secure your water sources, secure your revenue generation for your city and allow it to grow. And that's a big change. And then I was talking about the glass. We're working again with those connecting markets. And then the last thing, the last video here is, and I've kind of focused on Port Blair, but this could be anywhere. It's just that I had available the videos of Port Blair. So this is the disposal site in Port Blair, very typical disposal site, unmanaged, very irregularly managed. So there's no, it's not lined, it's not engineered. There's no machines operating on it on a daily basis. The waste is on fire because it's not covered. And so one of the foundations of a waste management system to make it efficient later on is to have that foundation set. And one of those key areas is having a sanitary landfill, because nothing else can compete with the financially free dumping of waste as this is. It's free to just dump it. Economically, it's not free because it's having all those impacts, health, the fisheries, the tourism, etc. But financially at the moment, they're just dumping it for free. Once you construct a landfill and you're engineering it, then that costs, and then everything else that can compete against that cost, then that creates a benchmark cost in which recycling, recovery, everything else can compete. And then your market will come in and start taking over, because they then have a baseline cost in which they can operate either at or under to compete against. And so that's one of the most important things the government can do, is to establish these and enforce the use of landfills. So then putting a market price on landfilling, everything else can come up and compete against that on the market. So we can see here, just very briefly, that this is I think I'm talking about it.
Comes down and right just outside Port Blair. And then it flows from there, even though it's burning, comes down in a stream. And then what you have here is all the light plastics. They're coming from that landfill beam.
So we can see it, that's another beach. So just to conclude, that's all for the time I have. So just to conclude, efficiency comes from institutions having their roles, responsibilities, and accountability clearly defined. Having the SBM, the solid waste management rules, the plastic waste management rules, the SBM 2.0 available, but making those rules not prescriptive, overly prescriptive, but having them flexible enough in which the actors around India can adjust it to their local context. Enforcing that sanitary landfill. So many areas, cities within India still lack a landfill. And there's this big expectation that we can go from open dumping to zero waste. And that's just a fallacy. We've tried that in many countries over the last 20 years. And we've seen that it just doesn't work. You have to have that foundation in which everything else is built. So pushing to have an engineered landfill must be a priority. And then just having a professional organization, making sure waste management becomes professionally orientated, to understand that it's not an engineering task, it's a multifaceted, interdisciplinary market or sector in which professionals are needed to ensure technology and economics and functionality are all integrated to improve that. And then contract administration, that business administration aspects is very much vital. And then finally, the enforcement of those aspects. So that's kind of my take on what my experience in India and what I think needs to happen. Of course, the waste management sector is huge. I could talk for hours about this, but I've tried to condense it into half an hour. So Shruti, I hope that's covered some of the points, and I hand it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was absolutely fantastic. And I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to listen to you speak. And thank you for sharing those videos with us. I think they really gave us a better idea of the kind of work that you're doing. And while the harsh reality of improper waste management in India is not something that's unknown to us, and there's something, there's a lot that we see on an everyday basis. I'm sure everybody in the audience is aware of the kind of crisis that we're facing, but it's really lovely to hear about the work that you've been doing. And we are so glad that you spend this time sharing all of this with us. So thank you so much. And we're all set to take up questions with the from the audiences. And if you're ready, can we get started with the Q&A?
Yeah.
All right. So the first question that we have is from Sankalita. She has said that this talk was very useful. Thank you, Brian. She's wondering if you could share some examples of how private players have been able to be a part of the solid waste management process. At what point in the supply chain or the value chain have they most successfully contributed it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, I probably am the best placed because I am working in these 3 cities that are problematic. We are my colleagues, so I'm working with, so I work for RWA Group, which is a European-based consulting, and we work globally. And in India, we've partnered with Deloitte and SciComm Projects, which are our local partners. Now, they know a lot more about the local market and actors and good practices. But I will say that in terms of where we are currently working with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs to try and develop the scope of works and streamline the ability for private sector and more private operators to get involved in dump site remediation, so legacy waste remediation. So that's a big area that the private sector are playing more and more a role, and that the government has set as an objective to get rid of a lot of the legacy waste. So we're working with them to improve the ability for the accessibility of other private actors that haven't previously been involved in that sector to get more involved. Collection is obviously a big one. So a lot of that is self-help groups and RWAs, etc. But we're seeing more and more private sector getting involved in the collection. And as they get involved in the collection, they can then get involved in the source segregation of materials and then the further treatment of that. Now, this is a big issue in that who is the owner of the waste? Is it the ULB or can the collector do it? And one of the big things we face in Kanpur is that the private collectors are not even just all the collectors, even the government collectors, they will extract the valuable material and sell it to the junk shops before it gets to the material recovery facility. So then normally we would have the material recovery facilities financed by that higher value plastic would finance the recovery of the lower value plastics. But we can't do that in Kanpur because the higher value plastics are already removed. And then we're left with a lower grade. So then we're reliant now on the PROs to finance the recovery of the lower grade plastics and for cement kiln to go to as refuse derived fuel to the cement kiln. But that's something that the private sector can get involved in. We're seeing with these PROs becoming a PRO, private partner, we're really seeing that that's an area. So we've got plastics and other areas where EPR is kicking in and PROs can be established, and those PROs, private companies, can then access these materials and recover a lot of value, and it can be profitable without government intervention or payments from the ULBs, etc., which comes with the risk I discussed.
Thanks so much, Brian. That was very, very insightful. The next question that we have is from Rabia, and she asks, how can nanotechnology help in solid waste management?
Nanotechnology? I don't know. Does that? I don't actually know. What is she referring to in that case? Right.
Why don't we ask Rabia to come in? Rabia, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, good evening. It was a very nice and insightful information that Brian shared with us. I was wondering that since nanotechnology is being currently used in most of the water filtration systems, where we use the filters having nanoparticles, which can be quite useful, I guess, in the solid waste management. I was wondering if any reports, if Brian could throw some light on that.
Yes.
Available. Yeah.
So when it comes to leachate, so we saw from the dump site from Port Blair, we see the leachate coming down in that river there. But in sanitary landfills, there's always the leachate that's being produced, both from rainwater infiltration and the organics decomposing and producing that leachate. Now, the treatment of that leachate requires the same water treatment as a wastewater treatment facility, or if not better, or slightly reverse osmosis, or some other biological and chemical reactions that are SBRs, etc. So that's an area that's definitely being looked at. Also, in composting, feeding, feeding the biological process of the decomposition. It also assists speed up the decomposition process. So that's another area. But like I said at the beginning, there's so many technologies, including nanotechnologies, including artificial intelligence and material recovery, that there's no end of areas. It's just whether it's financially viable and applicable to the instance where it's being required or being sought. So there are areas, yeah, but are they available in India right now? I think India is facing some additional challenges that should be prioritized, and then we can move towards that.
Right. Thanks so much, Brian. And Rabia, I hope that answered your question. So we have another question that says, in your experience of having worked in so many countries, what's one country's example that you would have, that you would like to share with everybody in terms of a very proper waste management system?
You know, that's a very good question, a question that I get asked a lot, but it's a question without an answer. Every single country has different needs, has different societal conditions, has different environmental, geographical, weather, etc. conditions, different financial, different waste. And that varies, as I said, even within India. Now, a lot of people will talk about the Swedish or the Scandinavian as being the gold standard of waste management. But what they have is that in Sweden, energy from waste is very big. Energy from waste is counted as recycling. And so, but the energy from waste, if you just have mass burn incineration, it recovers about 30% of the calorific value of the plastic. What Sweden need is the district heating, the heating. And so when you recover the heat, that takes the recovery efficiency up to about 70%. Now, Sweden and Scandinavia in general has invested a lot in district heating. So around the waste energy plant is in the center or near the town. And then they have the hot water pipes distributed to all the houses around. So that's the district heating, and that heats the water and the houses themselves, or industry, or greenhouses, etc. So we can't directly take that. Now, Ethiopia tried to do that. They invested 19 million or something in a waste energy facility for Addis Ababa. It worked for 1 week and then it stopped working, and it's not really worked since, just because of the waste types, the conditions, etc. Anaerobic digestion is also a very good mechanism. There's a case study in South Africa that I worked in, where they set up the anaerobic digester, but then because they knew the organics waste was about 60%. But what happened was that a lot of that waste is floor sweepings. And so it's heavily in sand, which is inert and it's not degradable. So the anaerobic digesters were filling up very fast with the sand. And so they were having to stop the process. And an anaerobic digester is the same as our stomach. It has biological activity. If you stop it, remove it, then you have to refeed those anaerobes. And it takes a long time to set up again. They were having to do that too often, made it uneconomical. So there's a lot of examples. I really like black soldier fly larvae as a treatment for organics. That's it's a fly that isn't a pest, but when it's a larvae, when it's a maggot, it eats through a lot of the organics waste and produces a high protein rich food for animal feed. And that requires, it's very well suited for Asia. Indonesia is going big into this, just because of the climatic conditions. It's also very economical because they don't have to import chicken feed, which is often fish meal from Argentina or other areas. They can make it locally. And that comes back to our security of food security and our circular economy, a closed loop. So, and that's been done big time in Indonesia, Tanzania, other areas. I really like that. And then the biggest challenge is ensuring the segregation of the waste. So black soldier fly can only work with segregated wet waste. And you can't just take an example from somewhere in the world and say that's going to work for India. India has to find, not just India, Kerala has to find its own way. Kochi within Kerala has to find its own way from Trivandrum. And that's something, if there's anything I've learned over the years, is that I am not a waste management expert. I'm always a waste management student because I'm always discovering new ways of doing it. And it needs to be bespoke. But there's a whole suite, there's a whole catalog of technologies and systems that we can choose from, and it's just finding that right one for you. So yeah, no one size. Sorry not to give you a precise answer.
No, that was really lovely. Thank you. I think you painted a very comprehensive picture of what are some good things happening in certain countries. Very, very useful. Thank you so much. Okay, so the next question is a very personal question for you. So what drew you towards solid waste management?
This is also a very good question. I studied, I initially studied at Scottish Agricultural College. I wanted to be an environmentalist in the agricultural sector. Then within that, I did a lot of waste management courses, especially in farm. It was a lot of, so on the farmland, we produce a lot of plastics particularly in Britain, in the crop coverings and greenhouses, etc. And also the anaerobic digestion and the food waste of the cattle waste. I then took a year out, and I was going to go to Antarctica actually, and then I ended up in France because the expedition to Antarctica failed. I ended up in France working as a chef, and working in a big hotel. I was exposed. I was the chef in a big kitchen, and just experienced, the food waste and the plastics waste and everything that was involved. And it was quite related to my work that I'd been doing. So then in my third and fourth year, I went to Edinburgh University and focused more on the waste management. But at the end of it, I swore I never want to be involved in waste management. Just don't want to be in waste management. Then I would join the army. I was compulsory mobilized to Iraq in 2003 with the army. where I was put in charge, because of my background, I was put in charge of reconstruction of the waste management system in southern Iraq. And it was there that I realized how much value waste management, what impact to a community and to the world poor waste management has. Because what happened in Iraq was that prior to 2003, there was UN sanctions on the country. So the goods weren't coming. There wasn't any trade into Iraq. So there was very little goods coming onto the market. So there was very little waste. As soon as 2003, the markets opened, it all flooded in and the waste was everywhere. And then that annoyed a lot of people and frustrated them to the point that they would attack the coalition forces. So by keeping a clean street, keeping a clean community, I just saw the value of that. And that's where I came from. But first, I guess going back further, just to finish off, my father was a chief engineer on container ships. So when I was very young, I traveled the world with my father to Hong Kong. So we would come from Southampton in the UK, through the Suez Canal, through Dubai, through Colombo in Sri Lanka, Singapore, Hong Kong. And it was coming through the Suez Canal that I first saw the greening of the desert and what mankind can do to the environment. But then, and then being experienced, just seeing that ships as well being a floating. So there you go. That's another long-winded answer. I'm not keeping my answer short, but there we go. That's where I got into waste. So since Iraq, I just kept on going with waste, and I found more and more interest. I can one day be talking about the size of a bin in a hotel, and the next day be talking about UN policy on a global level, and that's everything in between, every aspect of sector of society.
What a fascinating journey, Brian. That really was a lovely story to hear, if you ask me. I think we can take the next question from Jayant. Jayant, if you could please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Shruti. Thank you, Brian, for an outstanding talk. The technologies in solid waste management, they're so robust and time tested now. And this area is surely not a rocket science. If India can send its own satellites, it can have its own space odysseys. If we can run our own and run our own nuclear reactors, harness atomic energy. If almost 50% of the software written and developed and supported anywhere in the world is by Indian software engineers, why can't we do that? I mean, sometimes I wonder, why it surely is not, rocket science at all. Why can't we do that? I mean, if sometimes as an Indian, I hold my head in shame when I see that, almost 35 of the top 50 most polluted cities in the world happen to be in India, and 63 out of 100 most polluted cities in the world happen to be in India, and Delhi is the most polluted capital any country has anywhere, and there are examples. I mean, there are people talk about, how do you balance between, the developmental needs, the societal needs, population density challenges, and the environmental sustainability. But countries like Japan, England, Singapore, pockets of it, has as high population density, or perhaps even higher than India. But how they have found solutions. So I think unless there is an element of shame in us, see, you may have bodies like Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, as well as Ministry of Urban Development, Housing and Urban Affairs. They look at some of the policy issues, but the collapse really happens at the urban local bodies where you don't have skills, you don't have expertise. So why can't we create that? Sometimes I wonder. I mean, the kind of problem that you're talked about, to my mind, those are very simple issues of, how do we, can avoid multiplicity of contractors, and even if we have, how do we, ensure that their incentive structure, their performance indicators, they are in sync with the overall mission of managing, solid waste management in a city, solid waste in the city. So why it doesn't happen? So this is just I'm sorry for asking too long a question, but I thought a couple of things I'm interested in to know from you. Are there any studies done to figure out, since the Prime Minister launched the Swachh Bharat mission, which is Clean India mission, has there been any appreciable change in the overall environmental issues as well as the solid waste management outcomes in India? That's first. And second is, would you hazard a guess? Of course, different solutions are required in different pockets. But suppose, at the country level, you were to suggest three changes we must bring if we have to manage our solid waste more efficiently. What would those three things be? Sorry for a big.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah. I mean, first of all, you just answer the comment that that you're often ashamed of India. I mean, but it's equally so for us in the West. I mean, what Britain has done, what Europe has done, is that we have outsourced much of our environmental impact to the global South. India is responsible for most of the manufacturing of our textile garments, etc., that are incredibly polluting industries, and we used to do that in Manchester and throughout the UK, and we've just outsourced that. And with that outsourcing of the production of those, we've outsourced the environmental impacts to the other countries, to India, and enabled us to say, okay, that's being handled by India, all the manufacturing. We're not doing that now. We'll focus on our environment. And Europe has had an incredible luxury to be able to focus on our environment, improving our environmental standards, because we've outsourced so much of our activities of the polluting activities to India, China, Indonesia, etc., and not really cared about it. And so that's changing, hopefully, with extended producer responsibility, producers and other aspects of just the global waking of those polluting industries, and making those Coca-Cola accountable for the bottles they're putting onto the global market, both in Europe. So that's something just that needs to be highlighted, that India has suffered as a consequence. But also there's the balance that India has a huge population, has to keep up, create jobs for the population. And a lot of those jobs are polluting. And so has SBM 2.0 or SBM 1 and 2 had an impact? I don't know of any specific studies, but I will tell you that during that time, the waste has increased, the waste production, and the complexity of that waste has increased. It's gone from probably 70–80% organics down to about 50–60% organics. And that's not because the amount of organics is decreasing, it's because the amount of plastics is increasing. And so without SBM, definitely the impact would have been worse. Could there have been a better efficiency done in the way that SBM has been rolled out? That would have to be studied. I don't know of any specific studies that would say that. If I was put in charge, like I said that towards the end of my talk, I actually am a great believer in the government should enforce that foundation and then let the market deal with the recovery of the materials, find their own way. Now, if the government just focused on engineered landfills, ensuring that that waste is going into the engineered landfills and enforcing that and providing landfills throughout. I know landfills have become a very dirty word and no one wants a landfill, but what they do is create that baseline in which everything can fight against and takes away that zero sum, which nobody can fight against. Once you have that technology, you talked about going to the moon, etc., getting the satellites into orbit. The problem is that that's one agency. That's the space agency, has that one focused objective of building that rocket, making sure it's safe and getting it into space. And they are in charge of the suppliers of those technologies, of the components that build that rocket. The problem with waste is that the feedstock comes from every single one of us. And that's what causes the problems, is that waste management there is no technological, it's not an engineering task, it's a societal task that affects the feedstock comes from every single one of us, and communicating that and supervising that is incredibly difficult. So that's why I say landfill as a foundation stone. Then we can start developing the systems that compete against that. Now, that's what we did in the UK. And in the UK, we knew it was going to be a problem to stop people open dumping. And so they put a VAT or a tax, a landfill tax. So anyone who was taking their waste to the landfill would have to pay a tax. And because it was a tax, if you were caught dumping your waste, you were no longer committing an environmental crime or just an environmental crime. You were creating tax fraud. You were avoiding tax. And so the tax man would come down on you. The inland revenue would come down on you, and you would be chased, and your personal finances would be chased for scrutinized, and you would never escape the tax man. And that was one of the big things that changed it in the UK. But having that tax put a benchmark, a high cost on landfill, and then everything else came up. The recycling industry, the recovery, composting industry came up because they could compete. They could be cheaper than that landfill tax. And that's, I mean, very difficult to do because there's a lot of India that doesn't pay tax. I'm not saying that's the solution in India. And that's why I say we have to find our own solutions. But for me, creating that baseline is critical, and then everything else can come up behind.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Very useful indeed.
All right. Thank you so much, Brian. That was really lovely. And with that, we've come to the end of this session. It was an absolute pleasure listening to you speak. Thank you for patiently answering all the questions posted by our attendees. And we really hope to engage with you more in the coming months and years ahead. If not offline, then definitely in an online setting. But yeah, whenever you're in India next, do let us know, and we would love to host a session for all our attendees in an in-person meeting space. So thank you for your time, Brian. It was really a pleasure. And if you have any last comments to share with our attendees, please do so. Any message for everybody?
Yeah, no, thanks very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to discuss it. I'm very passionate about improving waste management. So like I say, I'm not in India, and it's up to the locals to improve the system. I can provide some experience from around the world, but very much just small steps. It's like a hospital after a big accident. We have to perform triage. We have to identify where the priorities need to be, focus on those priorities. Much of the problem is that we're just trying to spread everything. Everyone's a waste management expert and thinks that this needs to be done, and we get overwhelmed with things to do. We need to have professional bodies that focus on the practical, not the theoretical PhD student technologies, that practical applied waste management priorities, focus on them, and then from there build up slowly from there. So that's my advice, and I look forward to working with you, and anyone who has questions beyond this, please do reach out, and more than pleased to assist where I can.
Thanks, Brian. So there is a question as to how people can keep in touch with you. Is LinkedIn a good platform to connect with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn or via, so rwagroup.net is our company homepage. You can connect to myself or any of my colleagues through there, but LinkedIn, yeah, great. Yeah.